All right, welcome ladies and gentlemen to this session, panel session side event for COP26. It's a warm welcome to our attendees in the room, as well as to those that are joining us virtually. So please, those that are virtual, you are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, and I hope you are going to enjoy the session. Just to make sure you're in the right one, this session is about climate-related conflict, arts-based mediation, and recourse to redress is the title. It is a hybrid event. As I said, we have some online attendees as well. And it is an event that has been co-organized by the One Ocean Hub, the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, and the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. It's my great pleasure now to hand over to Professor Elisa Morgera. She's the director of the One Ocean Hub, as well as to Dr. Laneth De Silva, who is the head of the Green Climate Fund's independent redress mechanism. He has extensive experience in legal affairs with more than 30 years of service as a practicing lawyer. In Sri Lanka, he supported the Ministry of Environment as a legal consultant and was a member of his country's law commission. Laneth previously worked at the Environmental Claims Unit of the UN Compensation Commission in Geneva and served as director of the Environmental Democracy Practice at the World Resource Institute in Washington, DC. I will introduce Professor Morgera a little bit more later on when she is going to be presenting in the second session. However, I would like to hand over now to Elisa and Laneth for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Bernie, and it's really great to be here, although only virtually, unfortunately, but I hope that both our online audience and in-person audience will feel as included as possible. It is really a great pleasure, first of all, to introduce many of the colleagues from the One Ocean Hub that are also contributing to this event in person and virtually. The One Ocean Hub brings together more than 100 researchers from the marine and social sciences across the humanities, law, and arts, working together with coastal people and decision makers from the local to the international level to really try and learn from each other and from different understandings and knowledges about the ocean, and bringing together all these different voices to support inclusive and integrated ocean governance so that people and the planet can flourish. Our researchers are based in South Africa, Ghana, and Namibia, also at the regional universities of West Indies and South Pacific, and in the UK. And together we're both investigating and prototyping approaches where the interlinkages, the mutual dependence between human rights and a healthy marine environment can support integrated and inclusive responses to support ocean health. And that goes from supporting inclusive and integrating ocean research to ocean policy and ocean action, or actions for the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean. And although currently, I think if I'm correct, Laneth, you let me know, I think at the moment, the Green Climate Fund is only contributing 2% of its funding to ocean-related action. This may change in the future, as we know that COP26, more and more stakeholders are really expecting a decision to place the ocean much more center stage into action and climate finance for mitigation and adaptation purposes. But even if we're not quite there yet, I think today it's a really important opportunity. And I'm really grateful to Laneth to have reached out to us quite a few months ago for us to exchange notes on what we have learned around conflicts related to climate change on the ground, and what we can learn and how we can understand how to engage with these conflicts in a way that can lead to transforming these tensions into generative dialogue, where we can together better understand pathways to sustainable and human rights-based approaches that benefit the ocean, the climate, and human rights. So with that, I'll leave the floor to Laneth to contribute to the opening.
Thank you, Elisa. I hope you can hear me clearly. Welcome everybody to this hybrid event, to welcome to those online and also to those who are attending in person. Thank you, a big thank you to the One Ocean Hub and the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance for collaborating with us, the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, to bring this event to you. I think this event is going to cover some very important ground today. Now, just a short introduction to the Green Climate Fund. As some of you may know, the Green Climate Fund is the primary financing mechanism under the UNFCCC, and it is certainly one of the subjects that is being discussed at COP26. The Green Climate Fund has been set up, of course, to fund climate mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries, and to try to harness the funds required for the Earth to meet, for us, all of us in the planet, to meet the challenge of climate change. Now, the independent redress mechanism, of which I am the head, is one of 3 independent units at the Green Climate Fund. It is independent of the Secretariat, where most of our colleagues work, and the Secretariat is headed by the Executive Director and is responsible for developing the projects on climate change, helping the various governments and the other implementing entities and accredited entities to implement those projects and to monitor how well those projects are implemented. We in the independent redress mechanism and the other 2 independent units, the integrity unit and the evaluation unit, we are independent of the Secretariat. We are appointed directly by the board, accountable directly to the board. Our staff are appointed by each of the heads. And this independence is very important, because the function of the redress mechanism is to entertain complaints from people who might have been adversely affected by projects of the GCF. And so that is the way in which the IRM deals with conflict. We've received several complaints over the years, and we have processed them. We have a set of procedures and guidelines we follow to do that. And one of the early steps in that process is conciliation and mediation, or what we generally call problem solving. And our effort here is directed at trying to solve the conflict by mediation between the parties, and to try to help the parties, firstly, to build trust amongst them, and then to try to have them talk to each other and find their own solutions that they think would be best to bring the conflict to an end. So I'm glad that we've been able to collaborate with Elisa and her team. And so a big thank you to Senia and others who've been working behind the scenes to bring this to you. I'm going to end now and turn this over to back to Elisa and to our chairperson today. And I hope you enjoy this session, and do please, of course, ask as many questions as you wish to, and and we hope we can have a productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa and Naranath, for that wonderful introduction. So I suppose I should introduce myself as well. I'm Bernadette Snow, and I'm the Deputy Director of the One Ocean Hub, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this session. The session is going to be in 2 parts, and I will soon be handing over to the session contributors shortly. The first part will see a screening of Indlela, Yokuphila, The Soul's Journey, an animated film, which then would also be followed by some presentation and also then a discussion session. I would like to introduce the speakers that will be following the film and who have been key in the development of this particular process. Firstly, I'd introduce Dr. Dylan Morgera. He's a senior researcher at the Environmental Learning Research Center at Rhodes University, and he is also the co-founder of Empatheater. He is our current country director for the One Ocean Hub in South Africa, and Dylan is an artist and educational sociologist, and works in the areas of socio-ecological and cognitive justice, transgressive social learning, scholar activism, and African hydrofeminism. As a multimedia artist, Dylan works in the fields of visual art, social sculpture, film, and theater. Dylan is also interested in political ecology of storytelling and educational innovation needed to facilitate better story listening. Our second speaker that will be joining Dylan is Dr. Kira Irwin, and she is a sociologist and a senior researcher at the Urban Future Center at the Durban University of Technology in Durban, South Africa. Her research and publications focus largely on race, racialization, racism, and anti-racism work within the urban context. Her projects in particular explore how forms of belonging are shaping the social landscapes of the city in housing, migration, and environmental justice. She uses creative participatory methods and collaborates with colleagues in the art. Also who will be joining us or has contributed significantly is Ms. Phumi Mtombeni. She is an award-winning performer, storyteller, and theatre maker from Umlazi, Durban, and the co-founder of Empatheater. Phumi has taken on multiple roles over the years in theatre, radio, film, and television, drawing on international acclaim for her performance in Tin Bucket Drum, which is toured to New York in 2012. Some of Mpumi's other theatre credits include Animal Farm, Soil and Ash, Newfoundland, Ulwembu, The Last Country, and Lalela Ulwandle. Her work with Empatheater focuses on merging research and performance, and she considers the theatre maker's role in contemporary South Africa to be that of a healer and shaman. It is my great pleasure now to hand over to Senya, who will start the movie, and then we will hear from our speakers. Thank you very much.
Just while Senya is setting up, just a note from about the film, that what you're seeing now is a draft. So it's not a completed film. It's an animatic. So it's just some sequences of prepping. So you can imagine it as when you make an animation, it's a sketch. But the narration done by Mpumi and the score, the music, is all complete. And the final film will be ready at the end of the year. So yeah, enjoy.
So Senya will be sharing it. Thank you. Thanks, Dylan.
Yes, ngane yami. Why do you care so much about the sea, Tisha wam? When I was a little girl, my gogo would tell me the story of Indlela yokuphila, the soul's journey. Uyabona, my gogo was a traditional healer. Wayelapha ngesintu. She was guided by the voices of her ancestors who would speak to her in her dreams. I remember asking her, "Kungani amadlozi ehlala olwandle, gogo?" Every being has their time in this world. And when the time comes, we return to our ancestors, indawo yokhokho, which is the sea. After your family buries you under the ground, the rain compresses your body and squeezes out your soul until you are born into the dreaming world where you swim in the isihlanjana. You become ubantu nomhlanjana. As a young ancestor, idlozi elisalincane, you hear the song of the river of life and you remember the personality of that place. Downstream you swim, following the song of your great-great-grandmothers who call you from the deep sea. You flow down the river and grow older, remembering. You become ubantu nomfula, a person of the river. All the families and tribes of people are connected to different isibongo, spirit families. Our isibongo is Mkhomo, the whale. When umphefumulo wako arrives where the river meets the sea, you stretch out your spirit, taking in more memories of the world, and you sing all the songs of the clans. In the sea, there is so much to learn and so much to explore. It is a wide, almost endless realm of mystery, knowledge, and wonder. You swim deeper and deeper, following the songs of Okokabadala. When you get to the source of the song, you find Abandabadala who live there. When you first arrive, they are waiting to receive you with the deepest love. They will know exactly whose child you belong to. You are met by your great-great-grandmother who's waiting for you with her mouth wide open. When you enter, you become a great-great-ancestor. You embrace the memories, songs, and dreams of our people. Oh, soon you will know all the secrets. But that story, that is a secret for another time. You stay down there for a very, very, very long time. Until one day, when the matters of people on land are pressing and you are needed to share your knowledge, you hear a new song, the song of your next mother. She sings for you to accompany her, and you swim up to her voice until you float out of the water and are carried by a cloud back to the land. Until eventually, your soul rains down on the land, and your next mother drinks you. There, in the small ocean inside her belly, you grow and grow, only to be born again. Uyabona mfana wami, as ugogo always said, this heaven everyone wants a one-way ticket to. It's not in the direction the missionaries promised us it was. No. It's in the opposite direction. It's down there, beneath the waves.
Dylan, I hope you heard that round of applause. I'll hand over to Morgera now for your presentation.
Thank you so much. So it was a bit shaky my side with my connection, so I hope everyone got to see something of it. I don't know, Senia, if you would mind putting up that presentation. Otherwise, I can do it now from here. Okay, Senia, going to do it. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So I'm here in the session with Kira and Mpume, and yeah, I'll just give a little bit of background of how we got to this film and what the kind of process around this film is opening up for us in new ways of approaching ocean decision making and supporting ocean defenders in South Africa. So next slide, please. So I was like clicking, thinking I could do it. So we have been spending some time since we started the Ocean Hub work, working with many South African citizens up and down the coast, kind of asking many questions around how the ocean is significant to them and what threats different communities and groups and individuals, collectives are concerned about. So we kind of did this deep dive into co-defining matters of concern up and down the coastline. But today we're going to mainly speak about some concerns that came from traditional healers and African spiritualists along the coastline. Thank you for all the warm applauses. I'm seeing the chats coming up. And next slide, please, Senia. Part of this work, we developed a theatre production, which you can listen to. It's a full hour-long radio play, which we had to develop into a radio play because of COVID, but it's also a live production that does a careful work, that did careful work in 2019, traveling up and down the coastline, sharing back the stories of many South African citizens, and after each show, there was a post-show discussion. And these discussions became new tribunals, public, freely accessible tribunals that could happen in different languages, in which people could negotiate and discuss their concerns. And we actually used those processes and those testimonies to support a public appeal process and that was happening around oil and gas exploration up and down the coast. We then, next slide, thanks. We obviously gathered many beautiful stories, or many stories surfaced from that journey. And we have this massive data set and archive that we're busy trying to make accessible, publicly accessible in different forms, that really try open up and shift the ways and people are making meaning around the ocean, and how this meaning is often not included in many decision-making processes. And we wanted to make that more accessible. Next slide. Then during the pandemic, we were kind of stuck. We had kind of trapped in our homes and were unable to produce theatre that required live audiences. And so we used our budgets, our travel budgets, to make a variety of new things. One is to build a whole network, a coastal justice network that Taryn Pereira leads, through WhatsApp and online means. And I'm actually today at a workshop that we finally got to meet in person with small-scale fishers and ocean defenders here at the Fish River in the Eastern Cape, where inside they're busy caucusing and trying to respond to various injustices. Next slide. Then this led us to realizing we could actually honor some stories that have come and were gifted to us by South African citizens, and particularly a story that was given to us by Ntutuko Kozwayo, a Zulu historian, and a Sangoma, a traditional healer, Nkosazane Masondo, that Mpumi interviewed. And she did oral histories with them and gathered this very particular story that we just watched, which was gifted to us, and we were kind of mandated to share it with the world and to offer it in this play. And now we could give it a lot of time and care in building this animation. And we chose animation as it was allowed us to share these stories in an online form that still gives that sense of wonder and awe that you get when you're in theatre. Next slide, please. So this process has allowed us to do a variety of things. One of the kind of key messages here is that much of the decision-making and public decision-making that happens from impact assessments to how marine protected areas are established and consultation around that, to the ocean, building what's here is called the Ocean Economy Master Plan. There's a big gap in the knowledge that is included, and that's the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and particularly spiritual beliefs. What you're seeing here is a photograph by Kelly Daniels that Mpumi and Kelly went and were invited to a ritual of a African mystic Zionist church, where the water is sacred. And you've just seen in the film that it's sacred because it is the actual medium in which the ancestors travel and occupy after life. And so much ritual and accessibility to the sea has been taken away from many South Africans with the legacy of apartheid and the Group Areas Act. That legacy still exists in how, especially people of color, still do not have access to the sea or have very limited access to the sea. Next slide, please. But furthermore, there's an intangible reality, an intangible concern that is not reaching policymakers' ears. And that's how the ocean is the equivalent to heaven for many Nguni-centered people. And our research is showing that no matter how far inland you are, many people of Nguni descent will go and collect seawater at the sea and bring it back to inland to do blessings and rituals, that the water itself contains the soul of one's ancestors and contains memory and culture and deep meaning. Next slide, please. This has allowed us to really think about how do we prioritize these stories in this work. And we've prioritized this one for now, and we have many more to come. One kind of takeaway message for us is that, and for the negotiating space, is that with the massive oil and gas exploration that's currently up and down our coast, we have many different applications open at the moment, and public consultation happening around that's very weak and is mainly happening online, as inaccessible to many people, is mostly happening in English. There's not even yet any consideration that the deep sea is the mining or fracking or oil and gas exploration in the deep sea is the equivalent of mining heaven for many South African citizens. And so this film is aiming to try open up that dialogue. So we aim to share this film in public processes and public engagements and tribunals to open up the dialogue around that, and for many decision makers to think and see how that is important. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand over to Kira, who's going to just share something about this process of coming to the story. My slide hasn't changed. Yeah, Kira, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Bill. Hello, everyone. Really good to be with you. Senia, if you could just go to the next slide, please. And even one more, sorry, because Dylan has already spoken about this. I just want to give an idea of how this particular piece came to be and how important it is sometimes just to listen to even the sort of more small and rather magical moments in research where something seems to spark a shift in our thinking. So, of course, science nor heritage is homogeneous, and we certainly don't aim to portray either as this. But this particular story starts when a sort of moment in which a translation protocol, a kind of bridge between indigenous knowledge, ancestral belief, and science seemed to open itself up. So next slide, please, Senia. And it starts when Mpumi is doing the research for Lalela Owandle, which in isiZulu means listen to the sea. And she phoned me very excited saying, could I come around to your house? I've just had such an interesting conversation. And it's the conversation that she has with a traditional Zulu historian and someone who is also practicing as a Sangoma. Now, we had spoken to a few Sangomas in the process. And so she sat at my table in the house I'm in now, actually, and told me a story which I certainly, and this is something for me to ask myself, even after living here my whole life, had not heard this entire process of the soul's journey in ancestral beliefs in the land where I live. So if we go to the next slide, as she was telling the story, I started to draw the journey of the soul. In Zulu, Indlela, yokuphila, the path of the soul or the journey of the soul. And it's such a beautiful sort of ecological understanding. And as we were drawing it, I think it struck both of us, and you've just seen this journey portrayed through the animation, and how similar it was in some ways, not all, to the kind of drawings that we had been taught in school around the life cycle of water. So if we go to the next slide, when we drew out the more scientific, if you want, journey of the life cycle of water, there were quite similar processes happening, just a very different explanatory frame around what was happening. And this got us thinking about, and I think we should just be clear here, that we are not looking to assimilate scientific knowledge in indigenous understanding or spiritual understanding, and nor are we looking to assimilate spiritual understanding into scientific sort of canons, but rather just to listen to both of these, recognize their strength and power in how they are different explanatory lenses around how people make meaning with the environment, and particularly with water and the oceans. And importantly, to have those moments where these two voices can have a sort of chorus in which there are harmonies and dissonance as well. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Senia. And before I hand back to Dylan, I think what certainly myself, but I know Dylan and our colleagues that we're working with, we have these discussions often to ask ourselves, what are we learning when we listen closely to many different voices, to a chorus of voices, rather than becoming too sort of focused on only using one lens in which to make sense of our world, and to try and make sense, I guess, of how people want to act with their world that they're in. So I think in South Africa, and perhaps it's the same for many people wherever you are in the world, a seat at the table where decisions are made sometimes just isn't enough because of the kinds of power dynamics that are at play in those negotiations. And certainly, you know, scientific knowledge can be quite dominant in these forums when we are making decisions around climate. So more than a seat at a table, how do we create sort of listening devices, translation protocols, if you want, that enable some of those power dynamics to dissipate enough that we can listen to this chorus very closely and ask ourselves some more complicated questions. And as you would have seen in the incredible animation that Dylan's been working on, I suppose our hope really is that when we hear the song of our next mother, that we enter into a world which is far more inclusive and far better at stopping the reproduction of some of these inequalities. So Dil, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Kira. Just if we can hop through a few more slides in here quickly, just to wrap up and just echo some of those things. One of the things that has been really important with this film is that we are handling very delicate sacred knowledge. And so as part of our amphitheater process, and now we've started a small animation and publication collective called Shells and Spells, we have thought very carefully about how important it is for ongoing iterative dialogue between the knowledge holders and those of us who are trying to honor and portray this. So this has meant a lot of call and response, almost echolocation, back and forth between especially Nkosazana and Pume and myself, coming back and forth with them, trying to design characters, design the worlds, and think carefully of how do we portray something that's sacred like this. We did come to certain parts of the story that we chose to omit because those felt too sacred to be shared and those should remain secret. So we've honored that in the animation. So when the soul has met her ancestors inside the coelacanth, or her ancestral space in the Twasa realm, the Gogo says, but those are stories for another time. And we've tried to have to think quite carefully about ways that we can honor that. And also this very careful work we've had to do to ensure we're not trying to make comparisons, because often these, like Kira said, these comparisons can be a kind of violence. So we're really trying to honor the differences and see what opportunities and resonances exist in those differences. If we can just move through the slides now, one more, I think it's two more. The kind of other work that's been very, this is the call and response, you can just flick through these in here. The other work that's been really, really important for us is thinking of the future of this project and how will we take this forward and what kind of dialogue do we want it to open up. So a key thing we think about in amphitheater and with this animation now is the kind of political acupuncture. We borrow this term from our friend Dung, who really thinks about how do we strategically work with political rigor around balancing power and whose knowledge is heard and whose isn't. So carefully constructing the kinds of processes that are needed and the kind of public events and the kinds of dialogues that we are wanting to hold and facilitate, using this film as a generative start. So we're really seeing this film as opening up a bigger conversation, a much bigger conversation that we're hoping to see in South Africa. And then the third kind of real aspect of this is we're trying to mend the education of the marine space, which is very scientifically dominated, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there isn't a lot of room for heritage, especially intangible heritage. And also making this intangible heritage tangible through art, through storytelling, allows can arm people and sangomas and traditional healers with a resource to go into a tribunal, into a courtroom. You know, we do hopefully hope that this animation will be seen as evidence in a tribunal. We've done one animation before, which you can also find on our website, which has been used as evidence in a tribunal. And then we are trying to expand ocean literacy to include heritages. I think that's all. Maybe Senia, if you can just hop, we can just see some color plates of what the animation will look like when it's finished. I think we'll see them now. Sorry, that's just early sketches. Just one or two more. But I suppose here we can start taking questions, or I don't know if that's an option.
Yes, it is an option.
So there we go. There you can see some colors, kind of mock-ups of what it will look like. The character design of the spirit has changed. So yeah, and I think there's one more.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kira and Dylan, and Mpumi in the background, I'm sure. This was really a beautiful presentation, as well as a very important one. So the floor is open. So for virtual attendees, please can you put your questions in the question and answer box, because we can't hear you if you speak. So I will then repeat your question, and I hope the audience will bear with me and repeat the answer from the floor. If there are any questions within the live audience, then I would like you to please come here and ask the question so that the virtual audience can hear your question as well. And then the respondents obviously can hear from the virtual presenters. I hope that makes sense. Right, good. So the floor is open. Question and answers virtual, and if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Welcome to. Yeah, so that everyone can hear your question, if that's all right.
That's kind. Where do I? Thank you for a really valuable presentation, and I can understand now how you come to different ways of thinking through this approach to your work, which I would call almost the circular economy of the soul, if we're looking for simple labels. But I had a question of clarification, because you said that comparison can be violent, and I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit. I'm not arguing for or against it. I just would like some elaboration.
Can I answer that? I'm just going to move for a second.
Work in action.
Sorry, yeah, the workshop's just, they've taken a break, so everyone came outside. Yes, so I think the thing with comparison is really comes from what we've learned in critical African feminist work and through Black Lives Matter work in around assimilation. So often more vulnerable voices, or voices that have less power in kind of dominant dominant patriarchal Western heteronormative white spaces, is that we often seek to compare as a way to build solidarity or to build a group, but that usually that comparison means that the loudest voice or the strongest or the most socially agile voice is the one that becomes the dominant narrative. Rather, there's more interesting work that can happen if we honor the differences. And so moving from assimilation to kind of a more essentialist perspective, that each knowledge system is essential in a kind of ecosystem of knowledges, which is a de Souza Santos term. And rather what we do is we honor these differences, and then we find many exits and entrances, like this translation protocol, this film, between those differences. So I don't know if that helps answer that.
And I wonder if I could add to that. I think, comparison can be useful as a starting point, but it's not necessarily a useful space to end the analysis. So, for example, if you compare, it can be too easy to understand another epistemology only through your own framework. So whilst, of course, we all do that to some extent in order to begin an understanding, I think what we are hoping is that if we work more carefully with this, is that what you do is you actually start to expand and reshape canons that can be scientific thought, for example, as it could be indigenous knowledge. I mean, neither of those things are static, they're both dynamic. So the idea is, rather than to easily make sense of something different only through the lens that you understand clearly yourself, is to attempt to push further and ask very critical questions of what it means to listen to this form of knowledge over the ocean. What does it mean for how we understand our scientific, let's say, paradigms? I hope that answers a little bit.
Sorry, you can't see, but there's nodding. So I hope the question has been answered. You also had a question? Yeah? We have another question.
Yeah, thanks very much for this. So you talked about your work, ultimately, at least in part, having a sort of political aim, i.e. to oppose or provide evidence against potentially damaging new fossil fuel extraction projects. I thought it was interesting that within the film itself, we don't really see that. I suppose the only trace of it we see is maybe there's some plastic bottles that appear at some point as the kind of trace of fossil fuels there. I just wondered if it was a deliberate choice not to include that in the film itself, or not to talk about the sort of the perpetrators, if you like, or whether you just happened to take this approach in this film and maybe another film would go in a different direction.
Thank you. Yes, it is a deliberate choice not to add any politics really to this story, but rather to allow the story to stand in its own right and then be in conversation with the kind of various politics around the ocean space. So that our job is really, after we watch this film, to have discussions on what this means for people. We did make the choice to add the plastic in the river and the net that you see of the fishing at the end when the spirit is turning from a whale back into a spirit. Those are mainly because of, in our dialogue and our conversations, we found really interesting relationships between how the ocean is changing and how that's shifting, how spiritual practices are shifting around that. Also, the materiality of plastic itself is experienced differently across culture. And there's quite a normative Western perspective of what plastic is, and what pollution is, that is experienced differently in South Africa amongst different groups of people. So it is a nice place to kind of have it there, to maybe open up that conversation. But we really felt very that it was important to honor the story as it was given to us, without too many embellishments, and not to place our political ambitions onto that. And that's really not what I meant by that. I suppose what I meant really was we call it acupuncture because we're trying to find places where there's an imbalance of power, and we feel like bringing this kind of fully realized and whole story into that space where it's missing, and giving it, honoring it, and giving it this time and energy and resources and aesthetic can help with opening that up. So the politics sits really in the kind of cognitive justice space around the voices that are spoken, and not so much about what we want to add into this particular story, if that makes sense.
Maybe Dill, I can just add on that too. And I'm sorry, it feels so strange that we can't see your face when you're asking a question, but
We were nods.
nods, okay. So, and perhaps it's a little confusing because we've been working for 2 years with Lalela Uwandle, which was the theatre production, which is a much longer piece of storytelling. And that piece of storytelling focuses very specifically around oil and gas issues. In fact, around a particular application for oil and gas that happens just off the coast of the city in Durban, where I'm based. So a lot of the audience discussion, the facilitated discussion, the theatre pieces used as a catalyst, some of that went into legal appeals. So in the processes which are related to the animation, you've seen the oil and gas features quite strongly. But in this piece, as Dylan said, it was really about taking this beautiful story that had been told and thinking more what it might do to continue to expand these conversations.
Great, more nods. Sorry that you can't see. Any final questions? I don't see any in the question and answer section being asked by our virtual audience. No. Good. Well, that is the end of our first session. It's now time to go and have a little bit of a refreshment. We can open up the windows to the venue, go and have some tea or coffee or something to drink outside, and then we will join for our second part of the panel discussions thereafter. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone had a good networking session and break during this last little bit. Welcome to our online viewers as well as to our panelists. It is my great pleasure now to start the second and final session within the this panel discussion, where we will be looking a little bit more at multiple sources and themes to bridge laws and disconnects and inequalities. And we will also look a little bit at the intercultural mediation in climate change and conflict. Our speakers that I would love to introduce to you will be Professor Elisa Morgera, who, as I have mentioned, is the director of the UKRI GCRF One Ocean Hub. She's also Professor of Global Environmental Law, and she is a member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, a co-host at this event. She specializes in international, European, and comparative environmental law, with a particular focus on the interaction between biodiversity law and human rights, particularly those of Indigenous peoples and local communities, equity and sustainability in natural resource development, ocean governance, and corporate accountability. Elisa has also researched the environmental dimensions of the external relations of the European Union. Our second speaker in this session is Mr. Paco Jimenez Salinas, born in Spain. He is a lawyer by profession, which specializes in alternative dispute resolution with a focus in mediation. He has participated in cases handled by the Compliance Advisory Ombudsman as an external facilitator, and has in cases managed by the Independent Consultation Investigation Mechanism as a role as a coordinator, consultation or coordinator. In Mexico, he spent several years working in the field of community mediation. Amongst other experiences, he has also looked and facilitated at major multi-party dialogues, and to name a few, air pollution reduction strategies, impacts of dams and wind farms, and also strengthening of conflict resolution systems linked to land tenure and related conflicts. Mr. Jimenez Salinas has undertaken postgraduate studies in the field of conflict resolution at the University of Barcelona, political analysis at the Mexican University CIDE, and community company mediation at the University of Cape Town. We're South Africa, so a connection. Mr. Pablo Lumerman, who is our final speaker in the session, is an intercultural mediator facilitator and honorary member of ICCA, which is the Intercultural Mediator in Climate Change Conflicts. Pablo holds a degree with honors in political science from the University of Buenos Aires. He also holds a master's in local development from the National University of General San Martin and the Autonomous University of Madrid. I welcome Elisa to give her presentation online virtually. Elisa, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully my few slides are showing now for everybody to see. And as Bernie said, we're moving now into a session of panelists who are all, I think, lawyers by training. And it is my pleasure to, I think, share my initial thinking about how, as a lawyer, I have learned and been reflecting back to my earlier work and my future work, thanks to being exposed and collaborating at a distance, unfortunately, with Dylan, Kira, Mpune, and others in their team in using arts, as we've seen, for connecting different knowledge systems and helping us to think afresh about how we engage, including through legal avenues, in more supportive and transformative ways with the difficult choices we have in relation to protecting the ocean, understanding the interface between the ocean and land, and bringing that into the context of the urgent climate change adaptation and mitigation measures that we know are needed. So Dylan already mentioned in his presentation that what we saw today, the animation, is really only one of many innovative arts-based research approaches that we are experimenting and exploring and co-developing with coastal communities and others across the One Ocean Hub. And so I would like to take this opportunity just to highlight that, as Dylan mentioned, there's also work, other work within his team, Empatheater, so a collaborative and iterative form of public storytelling they use in theater, and that has then led to the animation we saw. And of course, Dylan and Kira could speak much more, I think, in depth about that experience, and hopefully we can do that in the question and answer session. But I think, again, from the viewpoint of an environmental lawyer and a human rights lawyer, what has been incredible for me in understanding the evolution of this approach and the research that is emerging is, first of all, how Empatheater has allowed to capture and translate a variety of voices, particularly the voices of those communities that are usually left out of relevant international decision-making processes related to the ocean, either because they may be silenced or because they're just invisible, just because decision makers and others wouldn't even realize that they have a stake or even a human right at stake in a particular decision. And I think the cultural and spiritual connections that Dylan discussed about how in certain cultures the afterlife is in the ocean and not in heaven is one particular way in which maybe many of us wouldn't necessarily know that there are important stakes and in fact human rights at stake in activities and decisions on activities on the ocean. But in addition, we know that often in difficult and complex decisions around the ocean or the use of other natural resources, often we see communities as having one point of view. Communities think this or think that. And Empatheater has been able to convey the variety of voices, values, pieces of knowledge, and contributions that different members within communities can make. The process itself makes the research transparent and collaborative. The script and the research are co-developed with different knowledge holders and community members. And as Dylan was saying, this is an iterative ongoing process. So there are several opportunities for researchers, both to really make sure they understood what they've heard, but also to be held accountable for communities to discuss with them what should be shared and how, whether there are different ways or different points on which particular care should be taken in sharing the research and engaging with the new understanding that is emerging from it. It's really interesting also how colleagues from the marine sciences and the social sciences, history, have all contributed to this effort, and some of their research has been embedded in the script as part of footnotes. And that is also, one of the particular richness, I think, of this approach, that then the audience is able to not only witness, but be part of a immersive experience where they will be exposed to different kinds of research, but not in the way that maybe would be just receiving a pile of papers or witnessing a drier presentation. The theater performance can also be used to model different sustainability scenario. And so it's also a way for even further groups, different kinds of audiences, to contribute to the research, to contribute to the discussion, and for their inputs to be iteratively included into the script and the performance. But maybe the most, one of the most exciting aspects of all is that through the experience of the performance, we may learn a new way to listen, and starting to engage with different knowledge systems and interests and approaches in a way that's different from our mindset going into a consultation process, an environmental impact assessment meeting, or even going into a more formal consultation. And finally, the experience of Dylan and his team has been that the participation in the performances, in the research, in the dialogues after the performance has led to the creation of new relationships of solidarity, not only between researchers and potentially affected communities or historically affected communities, but also others, educators, decision makers, administrators. So quite an incredible, I think, series of effects and impacts and further areas for us to study in understanding how this impacts the decisions and the implementation of decisions on the ocean. Equally, we have other colleagues that have developed, and Dylan is one of them, but other colleagues also based at Glasgow School of Art and other colleagues across the hub have developed a very much innovative fund, the Deep Fund, which provides for open calls for community-led arts-based research projects. And so it was really opening up to other community members and artists around the world to suggest their own initiatives along similar lines, but perhaps taking different directions in terms of conveying knowledge and emotions and connections to the oceans, and allowing others around the world who may not have the privilege of coming into contact with other cultures and different communities to experience and connect with those different understandings of the oceans and different solutions about sustainability. And at the same time, those projects contribute to highlighting the need to protect cultural heritage, including intangible cultural heritage, which remains an issue that's lagging behind, I think, at the intersection of international law of the sea, human rights, and protection of the marine environment, and crucially to support creative economies for the communities involved. Now, on the basis of this variety of research-based approaches, which we are still developing and which we're still learning from, and they're very much work in progress, I have a few thoughts to share about what has been interesting for me as a lawyer and thinking about the research, the legal research that can accompany those projects. And first of all, it's very clear how the arts provide innovative and really, in some ways, mind-blowing ways for us to think about support and implementation of law, and particularly implementation of international human rights law, but also climate change and biodiversity law and law of the sea. So that they provide this model of responsible and respectful integration with indigenous and local knowledge, both for research purposes, but also feeding into decision-making. And some of you may know that there are international obligations for us to do that, but often we fall short in the means we take to communicate and to engage with indigenous and local knowledge holders. Also, as I was saying, particularly speaking about empatheater, there's this opportunity to create new avenues and really new inclusive and generative approaches in spaces that are usually legally mandated, consultations, public participation and environmental impact assessments, also mediation processes, but often are not quite suitable, even when they feel at the letter, the requirements in the law, they're not really suitable for communities to be heard, from different forms of knowledge to be understood, to be given the same value than other forms of knowledge, and for those power relations that have already been discussed in the first part of this event to be somehow shaken, so that we could have more genuine partnerships emerging in more generative dialogue. And of course, all these processes also help us to show where the law falls short, where legal implementation is actually not doing the job. And so really help the lawyers to reflect critically about the structures in place and what needs to change. But equally, it's really important for us to think where the lawyers can then support with their own work, the artists and those involved in art-based research. And first of all, very much backing up the findings arising from this arts-based project from a legal perspective, showing where community claims, how the points arising from this engagement with different knowledge systems may actually be claims backed by international human rights law, for instance, or where the concerns are also backed by science and again, legal requirements. And equally showing which are the legal pathways through which the findings, but also the art-based methods themselves should be integrated even further into decision-making. And finally, the last point, which speaks very much to also the event we are at today, is how together art and law can support learning across scales, and particularly connecting the local level where we have real life impacts of our unsustainable decisions on the use and protection of the ocean, where we may see where we feel the failings in climate change adaptation and mitigation, with the international processes where we may have resources, where we may have opportunities for changing practices at the national level and supporting national processes. And so, for instance, we're in discussion with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization about how to use some of our arts-based research to support better understanding of the human rights of small-scale fishers through 2022, which will be the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries. And that may very much include virtual art exhibitions. But also importantly, with the UN Environment Programme, we've been discussing whether these art-based approaches can be used to support and protect environmental human rights defenders, including climate and ocean defenders. And finally, as part of an international network, including UNEP, UNICEF and others, the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, we're trying to include some of our arts-based research into learning tools that are being developed on children's rights to a healthy environment, including a safe climate and a healthy ocean. And hopefully there are opportunities to discuss with colleagues from the redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund and other redress mechanisms, how maybe the lessons learned in our research, but also the issues they have addressed can be brought into a dialogue, and how we can foster that learning across different bodies in the international system that are there to support communities in the fight against climate change, as well as in environmental sustainability and the protection of human rights. So I'll stop there and hope to discuss further some of these points after the next two presentations. Thank you, Elisa.
So thank you very much. My name is Francisco Jimenez Salinas, also known as Paco, shortly. Thank you very much for to the Ocean Hub and Strathclyde Center for Environmental and Law and Governance for allowing the IRM to co-host this event. Before I introduce you to the main presenter, which is Pablo Lummerman here on the screen already, allow me to offer you a very short explanation on why is the IRM taking part in this conversation around climate change related conflicts. One of the core mandates of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund is to offer affected people, affected communities, or potentially affected communities, by projects that have been funded by the Green Climate Fund a recourse when they have complaints, when they have concerns about how those projects are being designed, how are they going to be implemented, etc. So basically, we are a grievance redress mechanism, and we accept complaints from people that feel that they will be affected, or that they think that they are already being affected by those projects. There are two main ways in which we can try to help those peoples and communities to solve their cases, their concerns. The first way is, and now, I mean, I don't see the presentation here. Can we have the presentation? Because you will see the graph with the slides. So Pablo, I mean, I think that you are expected to share.
Yeah, I am. So you want me to share the presentation?
Yeah, I was. Well, yeah, I think that's, Senia, this is not, our slides are not in there.
No, sorry, maybe I will stop the sharing. I have only the ones that I will present, sorry.
Yeah, you can try to find the initial one, yeah, and then it was set. So basically, coming back to the processes, that conflict resolution processes that the independent redress mechanism can offer to the parties, there are two main processes that we can offer. One is what we call a compliance review, and which is an investigation that we launch to try to determine whether the Green Climate Fund has complied with its own policies and procedures, and amongst those environmental and social safeguards. And we try to determine whether in designing the project or program, and also in monitoring the implementation of that program or project, those policies have been complied with. If that investigation ends up with a report, and that report can potentially contain three elements. One is the findings around the compliance or non-compliance with GCF policies. The second one is whether, in case of non-compliance, harm has resulted as a consequence to the affected people. So there has to be a connection between non-compliance and harm. And if this is the case, then the report will also contain recommendations for remedies, remedial actions that are recommended to the board for being approved. The board can approve or not. I mean, they have the power not to approve it. I mean, one would expect that they would approve the recommendations of the IRM, of course. So in these remedial actions can include offering compensation to the parties. They can include also mandating wider consultation. And so there is a variety of remedies that the IRM can recommend to the board. The other alternative of conflict resolution process that parties have are consensual-based processes. We group them under the name of problem solving, and those can be it can be a mediation, it can be information sharing, it can be consultation, it can be neutral, what we call neutral fact finding, etc. But they are all consensual based. So it might be that those conversations around the problems do not end in an agreement or in a final solution. What is also very interesting is, I think, the dynamics between these two processes. So what parties that participate in a mediation facilitated by the IRM, they always have the chance, so the complainants have the chance to stop that process. And then if if an agreement has not been reached, then the investigation will be automatically launched. So there is always a threat, and this is where the power and the leverage to the complainant comes from. There is always the option that they might turn and move the case to investigation. Also, in cases where an agreement has been reached, and during the monitoring of and the implementation of these agreements, of the provisions of this agreement, people are not satisfied with implementation. They can also move it to stop to investigation. So that really brings the leverage, and this is very important, the dynamics. I was sharing with a colleague here that in my feeling is that the mediations in our cases always start with this power dynamic, a lot of conversation around how the investigation will impact the mediation, and it is not so much about building the sensitivity, which it could be really great to start with, but it is the power dynamics are very present. So coming back to the mediation principles that we apply are impartiality, flexibility, willingness of the parties to participate, etc. And those principles apply to all types of conflicts, of course. But given that the Green Climate Fund provides funding to projects that are going to be implemented mostly in all over the world, the variety of context in which we need to apply mediation are almost unending. So this is why we always work with a roster of mediators that are based in all continents. Pablo Lumerman is one of them, but we have many others, and the roster is constantly growing. We are constantly seeking for mediators who have an expertise, who have local knowledge, who can understand the context, etc., and the sensitivities, of course. And with that, I will then turn it to Pablo, that he will be presenting 2 case studies from Patagonia and Honduras that will illustrate how mediators have dealt with conflicts concerning sacred indigenous areas and different cultural perspectives and values. Over to you, Pablo.
Thank you, Paco. Hello to everybody.
Pablo, just before you present, Senia, I think you need to go back to the new presentation that Pablo just sent you.
Yeah, I already have it in my, so I can share from my computer, no worries. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really feel honored about the possibility of having you as an audience, sharing with you some of the ideas I would like to share. First of all, we are here to prevent conflict from arising, and if conflict comes, to mediate or to start any type of effort to prevent escalation. And my main focus in this presentation will be making the case for intercultural dialogic approach for conflict prevention and resolution, of course, from a mediator's perspective. And since a project, if it's not inclusively designed, taking an awareness of the values that the communities have and their worldviews, if we don't apply the safeguard mechanisms that these new funding systems have in order to have early engagement, facilitation, prior consultation for communities, spatial planning that includes the stakeholders, collaborative human rights integral impact assessment for projects, and also the co-design of the projects, giving full transparency. If we do all that, we are preventing conflict from happening and also guaranteeing that the project will be strong, robust, legitimate, and will deliver what it promises. If we don't have those measures to prevent and the conflict arise, then we have the grievance mechanisms that ideally will be legitimately designed from the perspective of the parties, especially community, regarding of the unequal power relation that today exists between state, private sector, and communities. Again, the dialogic intercultural approach is very important for that, including also not only the grievance mechanisms that the funder or the implementer have, but also connecting it with the local and national state-based mechanisms and connecting in this galaxy of mechanisms that can really provide remedy when conflict arises because of any human rights impact of the project. So then we have the judiciary, and then we have all the efforts for contention of the violence when the conflict arises and goes beyond the capacity of the state to manage it. So that is a stairway. Hopefully we stay in the first stage for preventing, but the dialogic intercultural approach should be there anyhow. So we go forward. Next, please. So some experiences to share. I am talking to you from Patagonia, from the Argentinian side of Patagonia. What the land historically belonged to the Mapuche nation. The Mapuche nation, or the Mapuche people, have lived for the last 1,000 years in this region as the Kurds. Here, today is binational because they are both in Chile and Argentina. And as any indigenous peoples, they see the land, the nature as sacred, and the volcanoes as especially sacred sites. When the Argentinian conservation strategy advanced through the national parks policy, the Argentina state established a national park on this volcano, and that was without indigenous consent, so we can move forward. And that generated a lot of claims and grievances from the communities. If we advance for the next, thank you. So just for you to see from an aerial view, where is the Lanín? In the middle, you have the frontier between Chile and Argentina. Again, the next, and you see the three flags, the Argentinian, the Chilean, and the Mapuche. So after a lot of conflicts, a new arrangement of protected area governance was agreed, where indigenous Mapuche communities entered the governance of the national park as a pair of the nation, the state. So they were included in the governance arrangement in order to do the planning, and also in order to tackle the sacred sites affectation within the park. They started a dialogue that now turned into the state proclaiming the volcano, the Lanín volcano, as a biocultural high valued area. A biocultural sacred site. So that co-stewardship was the institutional arrangement that allowed this conflict to be resolved. Next, please. Next slide. Is the Arrayanes forestry. Next, please. Next. So this is a round table where this happened. So the Rewe is a sacred area, the sacred space with a monument and some of the Mapuche people. This is a typical Rewe that was affected by a land development project, infrastructure development project that didn't recognize this Rewe as a sacred site. And after a mediation that involved the judiciary of the state, but included intercultural arrangements, The railway was rebuilt after its affectation because of the project through dialogue with the project developer as the main actor that recognized the damage and provided also, together with the community, the remediation. Afterwards, the next, please. Thank you. So one case I would like to share with you. Next, please. This is a typical ceremony of remediation, a ceremony that is around the railway from the Mapuche. So next, please. Yeah. Next, thank you. Maybe I can share if it's better. So, so the last case I want to tell you about before that is the Honduras case. So in Honduras, what we have before this is the last version, before that, thank you. So in Honduras, we had in November in 2020, we have very strong storms affecting all the Caribbean, but especially not only Honduras, but also Nicaragua and Guatemala. And they provoked serious damage for the infrastructures, especially in the coastal areas where the Garifuna people live. And in order to do the reconstruction plan, the UN facilitated a process of early participation with consultation to the people, to the Garifuna people, in order to understand the impacts of the storm to their own livelihoods and also their needs and projects for rebuilding. And that was very early in the stage of planning. So in order to prevent that climate-related projects out from this reconstruction plan could respect their rights and their early participation in the overall project cycle. So this is another example coming from another latitude of early participation in order to prevent conflict from happening in the co-design of the reconstruction plans when we're talking about adaptation or also projects for mitigation. So next, please. So the overall conclusion for my presentation would be that the indigenous peoples, their knowledge and their sacred sites are essential for any realistic climate sensitive transition strategy, because their lands are in the most relevant and better conserved ecosystems that the planet has in order to thrive. So the sacred sites and their knowledge how to manage the overall nature, natural ecosystems are very important to be included in any project that wants to adapt or to mitigate in order to get our goals in terms of saving the planet feasible. So that would be my main focus here. It's not only because they have the right to be protected, that is very important, but also their knowledge is essential for better climate project design in order to have those projects to fulfill their promises. That is to take out the humanity out of the danger zone it is now. That will be my closing remarks. In order to be short and effective. Thank you very much.
Very much, and thank you to all the speakers and for interesting points, and with this final slide as well. If there are any questions, the floor is open. Again, if there are Q&As from the virtual as well as from the floor, please feel welcome to ask any questions. Yes. You just have to unfortunately come to the mic.
Thanks for your presentations. I am particularly aware that today is the anniversary of the judicial murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa. I'm also conscious in relation to the imprisonment of Stephen Donziger in relation to the ecocide in Ecuador. So I basically struggle with the concept where real power, whether it's corporate or state-led, can be subject to this sort of mediation approach. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Not too sure who would like to respond, Pablo?
Oh, yeah, because it's very relevant, the question. I want just to share with you one image, just one image of a process where the state of, in the province of Argentina wanted to implement a health system that was denying the communities right to provide their own medicine. And now today, talking about the ephemerides, today we are inaugurating this intercultural hospital that was made in an arrangement between the Western medicine and the Mapuche one together integrated. So we had 12 years of conflict and tension and also co-designing of this project that today, this 10th of November 2021 is being inaugurating as well a new stage for the collective health approach for not only people, but also ecosystems. This is happening now, and it's happening after a very interesting intercultural process of facilitation between indigenous and state-based officials together, facilitating the dialogue between the state and the communities in order to get this project ongoing. So even though it's very difficult to impact on the public policy realm with these perspectives, the level of the crisis is also creating a good environment for this type of innovations to thrive. And that is something that we can be hopeful about.
Thank you for the response. And that did that help address some of your questions? No? Would you like to give a follow-up question?
Bernie, also Kira and myself might complement. I wonder, but if the...
All right, well, go for it, Elisa, and then Kira.
Yeah, no, I really want to thank the colleague, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, for raising these issues. I think this, of course, we're, I think, presenting research and practices with a hopeful approach and trying to see, I think, experiences when mediation and, you know, our art-based approaches have been helpful, but the reality is dire. And I think some of the particular examples that the question raised have really to do with the most dramatic and, in fact, fatal impacts on environmental human rights defenders, and that includes indigenous representatives and other activists on the front line. It includes researchers, and it can include, for decades, in fact, also lawyers working with those communities and trying to seek legal remedies in very formal ways. So this is the reality, and it is hard to imagine how one can change the power conditions and the multiple also strategies that are used and the resources that are in the hands of corporations and governments to pursue those strategies. I think what we're trying to do is exactly connect with the UN system and their resources, as well as, I think, other, you know, international donors, for instance, the EU and others, to really understand how to make sure that, for instance, ocean defenders in our case are not left out from the current support for environmental human rights defenders. And that's one, I think, the very recognition of the concept of environmental human rights defender has been one international response to those most dramatic cases of oppression of indigenous peoples, other human rights holders, and the lawyers and researchers working with them. What we learned through that engagement is that while there is quite a lot of resources and there's been a lot of learning about how to support, how to prevent the most tragic, I think, impacts, as well as support and protect those who might be, under the same risks. A lot more needs to be done. The UN itself, the UN system needs to come together much more to really assess what they're offering, where the gaps are, how different also bodies of the UN can work better. But equally, any other donors and organizations who support human rights defenders have, I think, sharing that task. And equally, I think, as researchers on the ground, it is, I think, our opportunity and responsibility to contribute with what we're learning on the ground, and, with the opportunities we have to experiment maybe in ways that the UN and others don't have the opportunity, and offer that to the UN systems and others to see if they can adopt, or if they can at least identify shortcomings in their own approaches based on what we're doing. And so that's the dialogue that we have started. But yes, it is very hard, and I can understand how, I think, in our hope to make a difference, maybe we haven't necessarily showed the dire situations in which we are operating.
Thank you, Elisa. Kira, and then Lalanath.
Yes, thanks. Just to say again, I think that is a very important question. And yeah, Pablo, undoubtedly there are instances where mediation can assist. I have seen that too, but I must say that in South Africa, those instances where it's successful to the benefits, I would say, of sort of people who are living in these spaces, rather than sort of compromising them, especially against, in our case here, sort of big corporate interests, are quite few and far between. And I think that, we've lost environmental activists in our country over the last few years who have been assassinated for standing up and speaking out. And what we definitely see is that people here who have become far more literate and more politically savvy about how to push back against some of these conflicts definitely use a multi-pronged strategy. I'm sure you've seen this too. So whilst you can have people who are engaging in the mediated process, that definitely means that they are also engaging in other forms of protest. So one is not, it doesn't take place. I'm sure you've seen this too. So I think the question is the right one. But my take from what I've seen here is that communities are getting far better at pushing back and strategizing across numerous different forms of agency. They might engage in mediation, but they might be doing 10 other things in order to try and keep themselves safe, and many times the environment safe too.
Thanks, Kira. Lalanath.
Thank you, Laura. Again, I mean, just as my colleagues mentioned, I think this is a very important question. And I just want to respond in two parts. The first, of course, is it is Ken Saro-Wiwa's death anniversary, and large numbers of environmental defenders, in particular, are being murdered over these years, and the numbers are increasing, particularly in the Latin American region. As a result, not only of those, but also of other kinds of retaliatory acts taken against complainants, redress mechanisms, not just us, but all of the other redress mechanisms, including those of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank and African Development Bank, Inter-American Bank, and so on, have become extremely sensitive to retaliatory actions. And they have all now developed means and methods of how to deal with those situations. Speaking for ourselves, the staff of the IRM have all been trained in how to manage retaliatory actions. We provide anonymity and confidentiality in those cases so that the complainants' identities are kept confidential, and other measures are also available through the fund to help it mitigate and prevent retaliatory actions. That's the first thing I wanted to do. The second part of it is that community company mediations or community state mediations are a very different ball game to the normal kinds of mediation that happen, let's say, between two parties in a divorce or in a commercial transaction. And many mediators are trained in commercial and kind of one-on-one mediation situations, and they are well trained in that, and they do that very well. But when they have to face and undertake community company mediations or community state mediations, those kinds of mediations involve an additional set of techniques and methods that not every mediator is familiar with. And this is very important to understand. So one of these things is, of course, power imbalances. And in the case of a community, let's say company mediation, correcting or how should we say, rebalancing power is an important part of a mediator's role, though it may not be so in the normal commercial or, let's say, divorce mediation. And part of doing that is building the capacity of the community to face the mediation, to understand what the mediation is all about, to build the capacity of the community to bring scientific information and their own knowledge to bear on the mediation. This is very much a part of the role of the mediator. And so that's the second point I want to make. And the last one, of course, as Kira mentioned earlier, a multi-pronged strategy is always a very useful one, particularly for civil society and communities to develop. And so even if they are engaging in mediation, to use other means, whether they be litigation or other kinds of protest actions, to be able to use those strategies in a way that could possibly help in the mediation and also build their own capacity. Those are also very important.
Thank you for those insights. Paco, you had something to add?
Yeah, I am sorry that I didn't get the lethality question adequately. I just went all about a new story of how difficult situations and unequal power relations could, after intercultural dialogue. I will stress that because sometimes mediation is not the right word. Mediation not necessarily is the right word for third side interventions that goes that has the purpose of transforming the conflict into more non-violent ways of engaging. And in that sense, the coaching and support for communities advocacy strategy and for community leaders ways of building coalitions is something very strategic for preventing harm, because when you have a good advocacy strategy in a violent context, right? If you don't have good state institutions that protect human rights in a country, then you have the risk that the grievance that community presents are seen as an attack and a threat from the perspective of the executors of the project or the government officials that promote the project or the private interest that is promoting the project. And when they feel and they see the grievance, they feel attacked and they respond lethally. And how do you protect? So Lalanat explained that the policy of the IRM introduced measures to protect the parties that can be affected by reprisals by attacks, because of that. So there are measures to do that, and also measures to prevent those risky arenas to be entered. And in that sense, the coalition building strategy is something key from the community perspective, but also working with state officials and investment project boards of implementation, in educating them to receive the complaint, to receive the grievance with an open attitude towards approval of their own project for their own good interest, is something that is also a line of work that should be done. It's not only working with the underdog, helping and doing the equalization of the power relation or protecting the grievance from attack, from a counterattack, but also working with the state and with the private sector and how they deal with the grievance.
Thank you.
I only wanted to also echo on what Paulo has said about the word mediation, because mediation is often understood as giving up to things, offering concessions. And this is not, mediators do not see that. So mediation is not about conceding to anything. So one of the very important aspects of that parties need to consider when engaging in mediation in those very violent environments sometimes is safety and how to safely engage in mediation. The rule of law, justice, safety, this is non-negotiable. These are things that cannot be negotiated. But you can have a discussion, can have a conversation around this, where parties can express their concerns and see if there is any progress. If there isn't any progress, then you can freely step away and move to another direction. So in these situations where there is a high level of distrust amongst parties, the strategy is about placing in the first place what is the main concern in engaging in mediation. That could be safety, that could be applying the rule of law to crimes, etc. And then from that you move on if parties can see progress. If not, then it is a risky, let's say mediation is a risk. It is not without any risk. People are in those environments is also a risky strategy, and you have to at least maybe people have no other options, so they need to try at least. And if they see progress, they will stay in the process. If they don't see any progress, they will step away.
We're shocking each other every time we pass. So we're a bit risk averse to taking the microphone from one another at the moment in time. But thank you for that question. It obviously has created a lot of debate. We did have another hand. I don't know if there's any other one final question. No, your hand was next. So this will be our last question before we close the session.
I hope you don't mind a naive final question, but knowing that the Garifuna are in Honduras and in Belize, so in a Hispanic and an Anglophone context, do you notice, or do you have any basis for thinking about differences, cultural, historic? I mean, the Spanish got kicked out long before the British did, so there may be more sense of autonomy in Honduras. I don't want to speculate further, but here is an autonomous community across national borders, and presumably if we're dealing with the rule of law, that may be different in the two contexts. And I wonder, maybe the Garifuna use that strategically to try and defend their resources, but it's not an area I'm very familiar with. I just note the fact that here is a people that doesn't have its own autonomous space, which is a problem for indigenous communities worldwide.
Thank you. Any responses to the question?
Yeah, I have just a little response regarding that. We are talking about peoples that are nations without a state. So yes, for sure, the state building in the Caribbean was developed in the process of colonization on top of the real, like the indigenous peoples that were there. So yes, for sure, you get also in Asia, in Middle East and Latin America and Africa, these that the borders of the nation states do not respect the continuities, the cultural and identity continuities, as in the Garifuna case, that is also a mix between indigenous and African slaves that were slaved and brought to the region by the Dutch and the English. So you have that mix there, and for sure they do work on an international level, working with the international treaties, with a strategy of trying to advocate for the states to incorporate in the state law these treaties in order to create a good environment for the rights to be respected. The reality is harsh. It's not so you have a racist society and also very exclusive and human rights respectful policies coming from the state. So the situation is that. So that is why also you can. I wanted to show a good case where dialogue, preventing early dialogue regarding recovery from the government of Honduras, together with the facilitation of the UN. This is important. The UN facilitated this process and tried to make it human rights compatible, applying those international the international law in the process, so mainstreaming it, with the resistance of some of the officials within the state of Honduras and the private sector, but at the same time, understanding and finding good resonance by also public officials that see this way of moving forward a very pragmatic and strategic way of making any project for reconstruction or for adaptation or for prevention from catastrophes from happening effective and knowledgeable and legitimate. So the cost of being exclusive is going higher, not only, of course, for the affected communities that are excluded, but also for the agencies that are fostering this new type of projects in the territory.
Thank you. All right, so that was the last question. It's time is up from here, so I think it's just my role now to close the session. I would like to acknowledge the co-organization of the One Ocean Hub with the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, and also the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, who is also hosting the lovely snacks that you're going to be having outside, which I would like to invite you to. I also would like to invite you to continue the conversation with members that are here during this opportunity outside. And I think that my take-home message is there are wonderful examples and mechanisms and transformative ways of engaging and changing, but also from the last conversation that we've been having, there's still a long way to go in many instances. And I think these collaboration initiatives and able to work together and learn through these processes can better include Indigenous peoples and communities in the ocean governance landscape. So with that, thank you very much for your time and attendance. All Q&As were answered online. I see one has just come in, and hopefully we will answer it after the fact. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much to our audiences.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully you could hear the applause. Thank you, everyone.